Good afternoon. The term Gothic is so well known and so often used as a catch-all category for the later Middle Ages, and especially for the greatly admired cathedrals of the period, that it's easy to forget that it was coined as a slur by Italian writers of the Renaissance. To them, the foreign style from over the Alps reaching Italy was in such contrast to and in conflict with the humanistic principles of their art of the 15th and 16th centuries that it seemed like another invasion of the Goths, one of the barbarian tribes who had raided Italy, precipitating the eventual downfall of the Roman Empire. So from Goths came Gothic, yet to us it is generally a term of praise. There are a lot of art historical terms that originated in the same derogatory manner. Architecturally, the Gothic style naturally evolved from the Romanesque, and one of the key transitional monuments is the famous Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. I should reiterate what you all know. Notre Dame simply means Our Lady, which is to say the Virgin Mary, and innumerable churches are dedicated to her. Notre Dame de Paris is famous because it's in Paris. But one really needs to say Notre Dame of Paris to be sure that you are understood. It was built between 1163 and 1250, for the most part. And you're seeing it here in a view from the left bank. As you know, Notre Dame is on an island. And from the left bank, that is to say the south side of the church, with the facade off to the left and the apse at the right-hand side in this image. The ensemble view, this ensemble view, is a famous one and rare among any kinds of photographs of renowned buildings, whether of the Middle Ages or the Renaissance or the Baroque, because usually they become hemmed in, if they weren't when they were built, hemmed in by other architecture, by the urban environment. Try photographing the facade of most famous churches and you find yourself frustrated. In this case, since it sits on an island, Notre Dame offers this wonderful sweeping view from the south bank of the Seine. I'm going to show you the facade, which also is blessed now at least with a large open place in front of it, so that one can stand well back, take beautiful photographs, absolutely symmetrical. And it is a symmetrical facade. It's the symmetrical harmony of the square towers and the entire facade which impresses us when looking at Notre Dame. It reminds us of the facade of Saint-Étienne at Caen, of William the Conqueror's Abbey, in its symmetry and solidity. But at Caen, the facade is mostly a solid masonry wall with relatively small doors and windows punched through it, whereas at Paris, the facade has been opened up by 3 deep portals, wonderfully cut in, as it were, into the wall, a huge rose window flanked by large galleries, and carved lace-like gables above, and then a gallery of sculptured figures below the rose window, and then the 2 towers, which are also quite open, with 2 tall lancet shapes in them. The facade has, considering the enormous mass, a comparatively weightless appearance. It doesn't have that solid masonry appearance that we saw in Romanesque art, and particularly at Caen. Another feature of the facade is clarity, lucidity, a graceful balance of the facade and all of its parts. There's a logic and a sureness in the way the parts fit together, in their symmetry, but also simply in their proportions from one part to another. All of this is the result of newly developed construction principles. We still don't have very many specific names of architects in the Middle Ages, but there are clearly great cathedrals like this were built by master architects with a strong plan of where they were going and how they were going to develop their cathedrals. Let me show you the nave of Notre Dame. Long, nave and fairly dark. We still have, as we did at Saint-Étienne at Caen, we still have a nave arcade, which is quite massive, and above it a high gallery. That is to say, the gallery is still dark and with high arches, and it's a real gallery in the sense that one can walk up there or sit up there. It was a usable gallery. And above that, again, this is not much later in date than, in its beginnings, than the church of Saint-Étienne. And so we still don't have a very fully developed clear story. Not a great deal of light enters the church until you get to the far end of the church, which was built, rebuilt later, and which has higher windows. It would not have been possible to carve away so much of the facade of the cathedral, as we saw those deep portals, to remove so much of the mass of the stone, if the facade and lateral walls of the cathedral had to support all the thrust of the stone vaults. The weight of the vaulting of a great church is immense, and it pushes the walls outward. Thus, in the Romanesque church, we saw the need for additional thickening of the walls, the so-called salient buttresses, to contain those pressures, and also a fear of opening up the wall, that is to say, too many windows too large, because it left less to support. As is apparent from a view of the nave of Notre Dame, much of the upper wall, the third or the clear story, is being replaced by glass, but the light is still not the degree of light which you will have in later Gothic architecture. The weight of the vaults here has been dealt with in two ways. First, the stone ribs, which you already saw at Caen. The stone ribs carry most of the weight, and they pass some of it down to the piers, the great columns, which rise between the windows, and that weight is carried down by the columns to the floor. The webbing, as before, between the ribs is essentially non-supporting and also constructed of lighter materials. The greatest remaining concentration of weight is at the convergence of the ribs at the tops of the piers, and much of that is carried away from the wall of the church by the flying buttresses, one of the most famous of architectural inventions. We'll look at them in a moment. Let me say one word about the vaults. The vaults are divided into 6 parts. This was true at Caen as well. The architect was not secure enough to just use 2 cross ribs, 4 ribs for the vault, but had an extra diagonal. He wasn't certain that it would support that weight, and when you see it move from this still transitional stage from 6-part to 4-part, as arcane as that may sound, it is an advance in the architecture of the Gothic period. The arches have also changed, both in the nave arcade and in the vaults, taking on a pointed rather than a round profile that we saw at Caen and in other Romanesque churches. This means that the thrust of the weight is directed more vertically downward than it would be in a round arch. If it's pointed, the side of the arch is more vertical. Therefore, the weight and the thrust is pushed more vertically downward, and it decreases the pressure at the haunch of the arch. In a perfectly round arch, or in any arch, this point on the side of the arch, the midpoint, the haunch, is where the greatest stress is. It's the vulnerable place. It's where it can break out. So it has to be weighted from the outside or in other ways controlled. Moreover, the pointed arch increases the height of the arch and therefore of the whole church, emphasizing that soaring quality that we associate with Gothic architecture. So this is a practical matter and an aesthetic matter, and it will be argued forever which came first. They seem to develop hand in hand. There is a detail, a rather startling one, of the flying buttresses on the exterior of Notre Dame. The very complicated area here around the back of the church, the apse area. And you can see, by the way, that this is a later style. If you look at this window decoration below it, you see how much, how fine the tracery is here. A lot's been cut away. This is later in date as a result. But the flying buttresses, which consist both of a lower buttress coming here to the lower part of the wall, and in this case, a higher strut going up to a higher point on the wall. What this means is that the walls themselves don't have to be so thick. because the weight is being carried out and then down to the ground on great piers which are at some distance from the exterior of the church, and not just down through the wall. So the wall can be opened up into wider windows, leaving in more light, etc., etc. Before I leave Notre Dame, I want to use the interior again as a setting, as it were. A setting for a famous and evocative description of another great church that we won't be looking at, the Royal Abbey Church of Saint-Denis on the northern edge of Paris, a church badly damaged in its history. Just 20 or 25 years before the construction began in Notre Dame of Paris, the Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, this was a royal abbot, a royal abbey, wrote extensive descriptions of the rebuilding of the narthex and the choir in his church in a new style, the Gothic style, but he called it the new style. Suger wrote verses that manifest his pleasure in the light that now filled his building. The church shines with its middle part brightened, and bright is the noble edifice which is pervaded by the new light. The new light, that phrase is an apt summation perhaps of the main feature of Gothic style in architecture. Suger's vivid prose is a delight to read, and today when one sees the naves of the great churches empty, as in this photograph of Notre Dame, we need Suger's words to remind us what these spaces were like when they were filled by people other than tour buses. It is something we've lost sight of. The excessive crowding that he describes in the next passage I'll read was one reason for his determination to enlarge the narthex, the entrance to the church, because on holy days in particular, vast crowds were to be expected. He wrote, in delight, clearly, "Often on feast days, completely filled, the basilica disgorged through all its doors the excess of the crowds as they moved in opposite directions, and the outward pressure of the foremost ones not only prevented those attempting to enter from entering, but also expelled those who had already entered. At times you could see, a marvel to behold, that the crowded multitude offered so much resistance to those who strove to flock in to worship that no one among the countless thousands of people could move a foot, that no one, because of their very congestion, could do anything but stand like a marble statue, stay benumbed, or as a last resort, scream." That's the Middle Ages. That's what Saint-Denis looked like. He saw it and he described it in vivid and deathless, as they say, prose. Let me turn from Notre Dame and from that description of Saint-Denis by its abbot to the famous Cathedral of Chartres. There are a ring of cathedrals around Paris. They really are a kind of belt around Paris of some of the greatest Gothic cathedrals. Chartres is one of them. It's no more than 100 miles southwest of Paris, and it's the first masterpiece of the full Gothic style. It was built between 1134 and 94, and here you see it across the rooftops of the city of Chartres, and you realize how it dominates and did dominate. These cities have grown larger in the 20th century, and yet the cathedral still stands as though they were the smallest buildings imaginable below it. Chartres is an experience that everyone should have because in part of approaching it from a distance and seeing its ever-increasing bulk as you drive toward it. Its importance as the first full Gothic style cathedral is due in part to disaster. The destruction of the recently rebuilt cathedral in 1194. The Archbishop of Chartres was a friend of Abbot Suger, and he had undertaken a rebuilding in the spirit of Suger's Saint-Denis around 1145. But everything except the west facade and its sculpture was destroyed by the fire at the end of the century. You have 50 years of building and suddenly it's gone, swept away. Rebuilding of Chartres was begun immediately and finished by 1220, so in 25 years they'd rebuilt, which was an astonishingly short time for any medieval building. The nave at Chartres is taller. It has a narrower nave arcade so that the verticality is more pronounced. It has a very reduced gallery level. And then you can tell that the clerestory has still more glass here because the openings have been enlarged and the height of the clerestory is increased. And so they dare to build higher, and so you have more light in the church. Unfortunately, photographs almost invariably fail to reveal the quality of the light at Chartres. It's unlike the light in any other Gothic church because alone among the great French cathedrals, Chartres retains nearly all its original 13th century stained glass. Most has been lost for lots of reasons, including wars, destruction, and so forth. Well, when you're there in person, the effect is magical because stained glass of the 13th century is predominantly blue. And it's as if you're in a submarine world swimming through colored light. It's just amazing. And you cannot, or at least I can never find photographs that convey that. I can show you one of the large famous individual windows, which is in a chapel quite near the right transept. It is very famous, and it's lower than, it's not way up in the clerestory, but lower down in a chapel, so easier to admire. And it is given a French title, Notre Dame de la Belle Verrière, Our Lady of the Beautiful Glass, or Beautiful Wall of Glass. Verrière really signifies, and it does take up a whole wall. And you see that it is the Madonna and Child enthroned in a marvelous composition, and in these varying degrees of blue, deep blues, especially around the side scenes where the angels are holding candles, and then lighter blues and whites and blue-grays in the Madonna herself, the Christ child in darker tones, and then she is surrounded by a deep, wonderful red punctuated with blue rondels. It is a spectacular piece of stained glass in every respect, and like the rest of the glass at Chartres, it tends to inspire one to the mystical, even if one is not given to the mystical. Henry Adams, in his famous book Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, of this window said, "A strange, almost uncanny feeling seems to haunt this window, that the effect of the whole window is deep and sad." I go outside to the west facade and remind you that it was the lower part of this facade, just the lower part, that survived the fire of 1194. And its two towers, which were begun before 1145, were completed at different dates in different styles. That's common in cathedrals whose construction stretches over a long period of time. It is on this west facade, on the lower part at the portals, that the earliest sculpture of Chartres decorates the portals, and we have to content ourselves on this facade with one example. Here I show you jamb figures, that is to say in the jambs of the door, in this case of the central door. We have 4 jamb statues carved around 1150. The jamb statues of all 3 west portals represent prophets, kings and queens of the Bible. They're not all easily identifiable, but that's the general thrust of it, and they are, of course, intended to underline the harmony of secular and sacred rule in the Middle Ages, by suggesting, in this case, that the kings and queens of France were spiritual heirs of the biblical rulers. This, by the way, is a line of thought that was to haunt many of the cathedrals of France during the French Revolution, when the biblical kings were all too readily identified as political rulers and were mutilated and destroyed as a result. Saint-Denis and Notre Dame of Paris particularly suffered. I mean, the kings, the Old Testament kings were beheaded on the supposition that they were actual French kings of the past. The figures that we're looking at here at Chartres, which are so wonderfully apart in one sense of the columns or colonnettes against which they stand. They have charm, facial charm, for instance, as well as dignity. And though they're attached to the columns, they echo the columnar shape. They don't jut elbows and arms out into space. They stick to their column, and yet they're actually carved virtually in the round, as though if they were removed, they could be placed on a pedestal. They are not the flattened Romanesque sculpture that we've seen several examples of. They really are three-dimensional. The style of the 13th century sculpture at Chartres is that of the early High Gothic period, a suaver, more convincing figure type. I want to show you jamb figures from the left jamb of the central portal of the north transept, round the right side of the, around the left side of the church to the north transept. And there in sculpture after 1194, we have the Old Testament precursors of Christ. I won't identify them all, but I'm going to look at two in this group of five that you see here. The center figure of this group of five is Moses, who holds both the tablets of the Ten Commandments in his left hand, and he also holds a column with the brazen serpent. And this particular image came to be read, understood as a symbol of the crucifixion. He also stands on the golden calf. Under his feet here are the golden calf, which he found the Israelites worshiping when he came down from the mountain with the tablets of the law. His body turns slightly on its axis. His head slightly in one direction, the body turns slightly in another, and the drapery, the clothes that are on him fall naturally. There's a flexibility to them. This is much different than the columnar stiffness and vertical drapery folds of the figures we saw in the west front, which were much more rigid. To the left of Moses, strikingly, is a group, not one figure, but two. It is a group of Abraham and Isaac, shown at the moment when Abraham, is about to sacrifice his son in obedience to God's command. Isaac's hands are bound, his feet are bound. Abraham's left hand cradles his son's head while his right hand holds the knife, a knife partly broken in the sculpture. The most unusual aspect in the context of Gothic portal sculpture of this sort is that Abraham looks up abruptly with a surprising degree of movement. You see his head looks up very abruptly, and he's looking to the next group, as it were. What he's actually looking at, you may see it here, is the angel, if you can make out the face of the angel who is emerging from under the canopy, the angel who's going to stop the sacrifice. And it's coming out of another space and another part of an unrelated part, as it were, the canopy over another figure. Beneath the feet of Abraham and Isaac is the ram, pretty clear here, which will become the alternative sacrifice to Isaac. Here we leave French Gothic sculpture, though I hate to. The degree of drama in these figures is remarkable, and they take on a life which is now somewhat divorced from their architectural context. They become freer to act out their stories, less symbolic and more narrative. But I want to turn now to two architectural monuments, both in the city of Rouen, in Normandy on the Seine, not that far from Paris, to look at briefly. I show you Rouen Cathedral, but I'm not showing you a photograph of it. I found that this 19th century image, which is an engraving which has been hand-colored, as though it were watercolor, by a little-known 19th century artist, it's very effective because he doesn't feel himself constrained by the buildings that were in fact all around the square. He feels that he can raise himself up by feats of imagination, show all of the facade. You simply can't stand that far back from it and see it in this way. And so it makes more sense for us, I think, to look at it this way. Of the Romanesque church that was here before this Gothic church, a church consecrated in 1063, about the same time as Notre Dame in Paris, only the three lowest tiers of the left-hand tower, which is the northwest tower, remain, because the rest, yes, burned in a fire in 1200. Everything destroyed except the three lower tiers of that left-hand tower, which is known as the Saint-Romain Tower. From that point, 4 centuries of Gothic style can be seen. dominated by the so-called flamboyant style of the 16th century. And the soaring steeple, and you should know this because these steeples are so dominant, but they are not of the period. They rarely got around to building steeples they may have wanted to, but they rarely got around to it. And in this case, the great steeple is a 19th century ironwork creation, quite beautiful. And at 151 meters, which is around 500 feet, it's the tallest spire in France, so it's quite imposing. Famously, the facade of Rouen Cathedral became the subject of some 30 paintings by Claude Monet in the 1890s, and here is one of the 30 or so, which we'll be returning to some hundreds of years later near the end of our survey. Monet was living not that far from Rouen, and he set up shop in Rouen for a period of time in 1894. And from the same viewpoint, almost all of them are from a single viewpoint, second floor in a building which still exists. And he took the same view, except that a painter can expand or contract, but it was always from that, almost always from that angle. And the cathedral, if it hadn't been famous for anything else, would be famous for that. I should mention, however, in passing, that the church here, for instance, in this Monet, is reflecting white light, a kind of white light, brilliantly. The sunlight is reflected brilliantly. Until very recently, the cathedral was black, dark from age and from dirt and corrosion and so forth. And because it's in a very fragile stone, they hadn't found a way of cleaning it, but they have been cleaning it, and it is returning to the brightness which it still had 120 years ago or 110 years ago when Monet painted it. I mentioned the flamboyant style a second ago in passing, that it's a late Gothic style and that you can find it in part of Rouen Cathedral, including the gable over the doorway. In the very late Gothic period in Northern Europe, which corresponded with the Renaissance in Italy, architecture developed in a striking way. Curvilinear forms, S-shaped or flame-shaped, entered the decorative repertory of architecture, both sacred and secular architecture. From the flame-shaped, the word flamboyant is derived. It doesn't have anything to do with the modern sort of popular sense. Flamma is Latin for flame, and flambeau is French for torch. So the word flamboyant is purely descriptive and carries none of the negative connotations you might expect. It was perhaps predictable that this expressive curvilinear style should develop, since the ever-increasing piercing of the non-supporting decorative stonework must have tempted the designers and the carvers to relax, extend, and elaborate their forms as the sculptors of saints and Last Judgments were doing. The image here is also in Rouen. It is a church just behind the cathedral. It is the church of Saint-Maclou, about 1500 to 1514. This church, quite near to the cathedral, is a famous example of the French flamboyant style, though we nearly had to say was a famous example because it was bombarded and nearly destroyed in the battle for the bridges over the Seine at the end of the Second World War. Take a close look at the remarkable virtuosity of the carving of the gables above the portals on this curving facade of the church. They are the epitome, the visual definition of flamboyant Gothic. In our next lecture, we will take another look at Gothic art of the 13th century. Thank you.